Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I was 15 the day my parents dropped me off at my grandmother's house like I was some unwanted suitcase they no longer had room for in the trunk of their lives. No warning, no fight, no explanation. Just a quick, awkward hug from my mother and a grunted, "You'll be fine," from my father before they slammed the car doors and drove off down the gravel driveway, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks and a silence so heavy it pressed on my chest for years. I stood on the porch with my backpack half-zipped, a pair of worn-out sneakers, and a heart that didn't yet understand it had been broken in a way no teenage girl should ever have to feel. I waited for weeks, at first trying to convince myself they'd come back. Maybe they'd had an emergency. Maybe it was just temporary. Maybe this was one of those weird parental decisions that made sense later. But there were no phone calls, no letters, no return visits, not even a half-hearted text saying they missed me. I learned pretty quickly that maybe was just a softer word for never. Grandma Evelyn didn't ask a lot of questions that first night. She simply looked at me with those tired, steel-gray eyes of hers, opened the front door, and said, "Well, I guess you're home now." And that was that. She didn't press, didn't poke at the wound I hadn't yet figured out how to describe. She gave me a room, a place at the dinner table, and something I hadn't realized I'd needed so desperately: consistency. She wasn't warm the way TV grandmas are. She didn't bake cookies in aprons or tell bedtime stories with soft voices. Evelyn was tough, a woman who had weathered life with bare hands and clenched teeth. She owned a small antique store downtown that barely broke even most months, and she ran it like a ship captain runs a vessel through a storm, stern, precise, unyielding. But she was present. And after what I'd just been through, presence felt like a luxury. Over the years, we settled into a rhythm. I helped at the shop. She taught me how to restore furniture, how to spot real wood from veneer, how to negotiate with people twice your age without blinking first. She was hard on me sometimes, but not cruel. She expected me to be strong, to stand on my own feet, to not fall apart every time life threw a punch, and God knows it threw plenty. But beneath that iron shell, I knew she cared. She was just a woman who'd been burned enough times to keep her softness hidden under lock and key. And still, deep down, even as I grew older and more certain that my parents had never intended to come back, some small part of me clung to the hope that there would be a reckoning. That someday they'd call. That one day I'd get an email or a letter, or even just a stupid forwarded meme with a "thinking of you" tag, something to show that they remembered I existed. But nothing ever came. Not birthdays, not holidays, not graduation, not even a passing mention through distant relatives. It was like I'd been scrubbed from their story altogether, erased like a mistake they were too proud to admit they'd made. I thought I had made peace with that. I thought I had tucked those wounds away, buried them deep enough under years of routine and healing and Evelyn's sharp-edged love. I thought I had moved on, that they no longer had any power over me, that if I ever saw them again, I'd feel nothing but emptiness where their place used to be. But grief has a way of unearthing everything you thought you'd buried for good. When Evelyn passed, it was sudden, a stroke that hit fast and hard, gone before the ambulance even reached the house. I held her hand as it went cold, whispered thank yous she couldn't hear anymore, and cried in a way I hadn't since I was 15. The funeral came fast, simple, like she would have wanted. No flowers, no fuss, just a pine casket and a few familiar faces from town. And I thought that would be it. I thought I'd say goodbye to the only real parent I'd ever had, bury her, and try to figure out how to keep breathing in a world without her. But as I stepped out of the church doors and saw them standing by the hearse, smirking, polished, smug as hell, I realized life wasn't done taking swings at me. My parents had returned. After 10 years of silence, 10 years of pretending I didn't exist, 10 years of abandonment, they showed up like nothing had happened, whispering condolences to people they hadn't spoken to in over a decade, hugging folks like they were part of some warm family memory instead of a wound I'd spent years learning to live with. I watched them from the distance, my stomach nodding in a way I hadn't felt in years, and I could hear them laughing softly to themselves as they glanced around the crowd. Then I heard my father say it, like a damn punch to the gut. "We'll get everything, of course," he muttered to my mother, too low for anyone else to hear, but clear enough for me to catch every vile word. "We're her real family." And that was the moment I knew they weren't here to mourn. They were here to collect. And just like that, my grief turned to fire. They came dressed in black like the rest of us, but there was something so rehearsed in their sorrow, so theatrically measured, it made my skin crawl just watching them. My father wore a neatly pressed suit I'd never seen before, probably rented for the occasion, while my mother draped herself in a lace shawl that looked expensive but hollow, like a costume meant to impress people who actually knew grief. They walked through the chapel like they owned the place, nodding politely at neighbors they hadn't spoken to in over a decade, shaking hands with men Evelyn had shared her last years with, hugging women who'd helped me through college applications and heartbreaks. People my parents wouldn't recognize if they tripped over them in the street. I stood off to the side near the casket, gripping the edge of a wooden pew so tightly that my knuckles had gone pale. I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't stop watching the two people who had ripped out my foundation and now pretended to stand on the moral high ground like nothing had ever happened. They looked around the room with practiced expressions of grief, nodding at the service as if Evelyn had been a beloved part of their lives, not a burden they abandoned me with when parenting got too inconvenient. When they finally noticed me, my mother's face shifted just slightly, an expression that tried to mix surprise with affection, but ended up looking more like she'd bitten into something sour. She came over first, arms outstretched like she expected me to fall into them, like 10 years of silence could be erased with a single, awkward hug. Her perfume was the same, something overly floral and suffocating, and as she wrapped her arms around me, I felt nothing but cold, bitter revulsion crawling down my spine. "Oh, honey," she whispered, voice thick with artificial warmth, "you've grown into such a beautiful woman." I pulled away before she could finish pretending we were family. I gave her a nod, flat and mechanical, then turned my eyes back to Evelyn's casket like it was a shield between us. My father followed, standing beside her with his hands clasped behind his back like he was inspecting a business deal instead of mourning the woman who raised his daughter. He didn't even try to hug me, just offered a curt nod and said, "She kept the place in good shape, I see." That was it. That was all he had to say after vanishing from my life for a full decade. Nothing about the years lost, the milestones missed, the damage done. Just a comment about the house, like he was already making mental inventory of what could be sold, what could be gutted, what could be turned into cash. I should have said something then, should have screamed or cursed or demanded answers, but there was something about their smug composure that made me want to wait, to watch them dig their own graves inch by inch with every arrogant word. They mingled after the service like vultures circling a carcass, laughing too loud at quiet jokes, squeezing hands a bit too firmly, dropping remarks about how Evelyn was one of a kind, strong-willed, a tough old bird. I wanted to scream that none of them knew her like I did, that they hadn't seen the tenderness behind her sharp tongue, the quiet way she'd fold laundry while humming old blue songs, the way she'd rest her hand on my shoulder when I came home from work late and exhausted. But I stayed silent. I kept my fire beneath the surface, because something in my gut told me this wasn't over, not yet. And then I heard them talking, voices just low enough to suggest secrecy, but loud enough to carry across the polished floor of the funeral home's reception hall. My father was leaning against a wall near the guest book, speaking to my mother with that same half-smile I remembered from the day they left me behind. "Well, at least we'll get everything now," he said, laughing under his breath. "After all, we're her real family." His words hit like a slap in the face, sharp and acidic, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My mother chuckled softly, slipping a cigarette from her purse even though she knew damn well Evelyn hated smoking. "She must have left the house, the store, probably even the accounts," she said with a smirk, as if this was all part of some reward they'd earned for showing up. "Let the girl grieve, we'll handle the real business." I wanted to walk over and tell them exactly what I thought of their real family performance, wanted to rip into them and tear down every illusion they'd so carefully constructed for the people around us, but I didn't. Not yet. I just watched. I stood there, calm on the outside, but boiling underneath, and smiled quietly to myself. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew Evelyn. I knew her far better than they ever had, and if there was one thing that woman hated more than anything else in the world, it was greed disguised as kinship. She didn't trust easily, and she trusted my parents least of all. And if I knew Evelyn really knew her, then there was no damn way she left her legacy in the hands of two people who saw her only as a bank account waiting to be unlocked. Have you ever had someone walk back into your life like they never left, expecting you to forget everything? Expecting you to smile, to open the door, to welcome them in like the years of pain were just a minor detour in an otherwise loving relationship? What would you do if the very people who broke you thought they deserved your happiness now? Let me know in the comments, because I'll be honest, I wasn't sure what I was going to do either. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. And then Grandma's lawyer stood up and opened the will. The funeral home had a back room set aside for the reading of Evelyn's will, a quiet little space filled with dusty leather chairs, mahogany bookshelves lined with volumes no one had touched in years, and the kind of heavy silence that hangs in the air like a curtain before a storm. The lawyer, Mr. Calloway, was an old man with thick-rimmed glasses and a voice like worn-out gravel, the kind of man who had probably buried more secrets than most people ever confessed. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses as we all sat down, the air stiff with tension and unspoken expectation, the kind of expectation only people who believe they're owed something can produce. My parents sat opposite me, still wearing their smug little smirks, the corners of their mouths twitching every time someone mentioned the word estate, their eyes darting between the lawyer and each other like two gamblers waiting for the final card to be laid down. My father leaned back in his chair like he'd already won, fingers laced behind his head, while my mother crossed her legs and straightened her blouse like she was preparing to step onto a stage. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, pretending not to notice their arrogance, pretending not to hear the occasional whisper between them, little fragments of greed masquerading as family talk. Mr. Calloway opened the manila envelope slowly, his fingers deliberate, like each crease carried weight. He pulled out a stack of papers, cleared his throat again, and began to read Evelyn's final words with a steady, unemotional tone that somehow made the whole thing feel colder than the casket we'd just buried her in. To my granddaughter, the only person who ever truly stood beside me when it mattered, I leave the house on Mill Road, including all its contents, personal belongings, and adjoining land. I leave to her my antique store, Evelyn's keepsakes, and all financial assets tied to it. I leave to her the sum of my personal savings, currently held in the account ending in 0489, along with the remaining balance of my retirement fund. There was a long silence after those words, the kind that grows thick and awkward when people realize the room has just shifted in an irreversible way. My parents' expressions began to change slowly, like watching paint peel from a wall, their confident grins giving way to furrowed brows, then to tight-lipped discomfort, and finally to something much closer to rage. Mr. Calloway continued reading without pause. To my son, Robert, and his wife, Marianne, I leave a single item, a box stored in my attic, labeled for those who chose to forget. Its contents are theirs to do with as they see fit, though I suspect they won't find much comfort in what they discover. I didn't laugh, though I wanted to. I didn't even look at them. I just stared straight ahead at the lawyer, willing myself to stay calm while my mother hissed something under her breath and my father clenched his jaw so tight I thought I heard his molars crack. Their indignation simmered like a pot about to boil over, but I didn't care anymore. I had spent 10 years wondering if I'd ever feel a sense of justice, and here it was plain, blunt, undeniable. But Mr. Calloway wasn't done. "There is one final item," he said, carefully sliding a smaller envelope from the bottom of the stack. A personal letter addressed to her granddaughter, to be opened and read privately, as per Evelyn's instructions. He handed it to me, and I took it slowly, my fingers trembling just slightly as the weight of it settled in my palm. The envelope was thick, handwritten in Evelyn's sharp cursive, sealed with wax like something out of an old novel. I didn't open it there, not with their eyes burning holes through me. I just nodded politely, tucked it into my coat pocket, and stood up. My mother's voice broke the silence first, tight and shaking with disbelief. "This is a mistake," she said, standing up abruptly. "She must have. This isn't. She didn't mean to do this." But Mr. Calloway was unmoved. "Mrs. Halston, your mother made her wishes very clear. Everything has been legally documented, notarized, and witnessed. There is no mistake." My father's face had gone pale, not the kind of pale that comes from grief, but the kind that creeps in when a man realizes he's lost something he already thought was his. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, his hands curling into fists on his knees like he was deciding whether to shout or punch the wall. Instead, he just stood there, frozen, glaring at me like I'd stolen something, like I was a thief instead of a daughter who'd simply endured more than they ever had the decency to imagine. I didn't speak to them as I walked out. I didn't need to. Their silence behind me said everything I ever needed to hear from them. I drove back to the house in near silence, the letter still untouched in my pocket, Evelyn's voice echoing faintly in the back of my mind as though she was sitting beside me, whispering something important just out of reach. When I finally sat down on the porch steps and opened the envelope, I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe a final goodbye, maybe some comforting words. But what I found was something else entirely. The letter was short, handwritten in that same crisp, no-nonsense script Evelyn had used for grocery lists and tax notes. It read, "My sweet girl, you were always stronger than you believed. You gave me purpose when my body was tired and my heart was worn thin. I leave you everything not because you deserve pity, but because you earned every piece of it through love, loyalty, and resilience. One last thing, go to the basement. Forgive them if you can. But don't forget what I hid for you." And that's when I remembered the basement. The next morning, I didn't even finish my coffee before driving straight to Mr. Calloway's office, the cedar chest still open in my mind like a wound that refused to close, its contents clawing at the edges of everything I thought I'd finally laid to rest. I sat across from the old lawyer at his polished oak desk, papers spread out like broken pieces of a puzzle I never knew I had been part of, and I watched his face tighten with every page he read, his mouth thinning into a line that said more than any words could. He didn't interrupt me, didn't offer shallow comfort or dismiss the implications. He just kept reading, his eyes growing darker as the truth unfolded in front of him like rot peeling back from a structure that had looked solid only moments before. When he finally leaned back in his chair and let out a long, low sigh, I knew what he was about to say wouldn't be good. He adjusted his glasses slowly, tapped one of the forged documents with his index finger, and said, "This isn't just morally disgusting, it's illegal. Your parents used your name and Evelyn's assets to secure a real estate deal while you were still a minor, and they had absolutely no legal right to do that without your signature. This power of attorney was falsified, plain and simple. If we wanted to press charges, we'd have a strong case for fraud, forgery, and maybe even conspiracy to defraud a minor." The words hit like a cold slap across the face, not because I didn't expect them, but because hearing them spoken out loud made everything feel heavier, more permanent. This wasn't just about abandonment anymore. This wasn't just about emotional damage or years of silence. This was about theft, exploitation, and betrayal wrapped up in legal documents and sleazy property transactions. They hadn't just walked away from me, they'd used me like a pawn in their crooked game and left me behind like the bill for a dinner they'd never intended to pay for. But even as the rage twisted in my gut and the thought of revenge tasted sweet on my tongue, something inside me whispered, "Not yet, not like this." Pressing charges might have been satisfying in the short term, sure. Watching them squirm in court, watching their fake smiles dissolve under depositions and subpoenas, would have scratched a certain itch. But I wanted more than that. I wanted something that would last longer than a court ruling. I wanted something they couldn't just wiggle out of with a half-decent lawyer and some crocodile tears. I wanted something public. Something permanent. Something poetic. That night, I walked through Evelyn's old store, turning on the lights one by one, listening to the familiar buzz of fluorescent bulbs overhead, the smell of dust and varnish and aged wood rising from every surface like memory itself. The shelves were still lined with old clocks, glassware, Furniture pieces Evelyn had polished and restored with care, pieces people had dismissed as junk until she turned them into art. I ran my fingers along the counter where I used to sit and do homework while she rang up customers, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I reopened the shop within a month. But I didn't call it Evelyn's Keepsakes anymore. I renamed it Left Behind. I redesigned every inch of the store around that concept: abandonment, loss, survival. I curated displays with haunting precision, a corner full of mismatched chairs with tags reading, "Too broken to keep, too stubborn to disappear," a section of old suitcases labeled, "For the ones they didn't come back for," shelves of chipped dishes under a hand-painted sign that said, "Some things still hold together, even after the fall." I created installations that told stories without words, stories that mirrored my own, stories that made people stop and stare and wonder what the hell had happened behind those doors before they ever even met me. I didn't advertise the truth at first. I didn't need to. Word spread faster than I expected. Locals started coming in out of curiosity, then strangers, then bloggers, then journalists. Someone snapped photos, someone else wrote an article, and suddenly Left Behind became more than a store. It became a movement, a symbol, a shrine to every person who'd ever been used, discarded, or forgotten by people who were supposed to love them. And just like that, the spotlight turned on them. Because the moment people started asking about the meaning behind the displays, the story came out. People started digging, connecting dots, pulling threads. The old property deal surfaced in local real estate archives. The power of attorney document got leaked. Some anonymous source, definitely not me, sent copies of the forged paperwork to a local news station. It didn't take long before reporters were knocking on my parents' door, asking uncomfortable questions, publishing stories with headlines that read like Poetic Justice, Daughter turns survivor turns heir, and exposes family's fraud in viral shop. Their new partners in whatever shady business they'd moved on to? They bailed fast. Nobody wants to be associated with fraud, not when it's dressed up in a handcrafted window display and splashed across social media with hashtags like #LeftBehind and #NotYourPawn. My parents tried to fight it at first, issued some half-assed statements about misunderstandings and emotional strain, but no one bought it. You can't lie your way out of truth when it's wrapped in metaphor and hung in the front window of a store that's become a living, breathing message. They lost business contacts. They lost face. They lost whatever threadbare grip they had on whatever reputation they'd scraped together over the years. And I watched it all happen quietly, steadily, with a kind of satisfaction that didn't need applause. But karma wasn't done with them yet. I still had one more card to play. The chaos had quieted in the weeks that followed the media firestorm, the phone calls had slowed, the reporters had lost interest, and the dust had finally started to settle on what had become the most poetic takedown of my life. But just as I thought I'd reached the end of the story, that all the pieces had been laid bare and all the skeletons had danced their final waltz, one more thread unraveled, slow and quiet like a whisper you almost miss if you're not paying close enough attention. It began with a phone call from Mr. Calloway, his voice calm but laced with something I couldn't quite name, maybe surprise, maybe caution, maybe just the weight of knowing one more truth was about to surface whether I was ready or not. "There's one more thing," he said, clearing his throat the way he always did before delivering something heavy. "It appears your grandmother had an asset not listed in the primary will. A cabin, registered under a different name. It's legally outside the estate you inherited, but she purchased it using one of her older aliases, Clara Monroe. At first, the name meant nothing to me. I'd never heard it before, not in family stories, not in passing conversation, not even in the quiet moments when Evelyn had spoken more openly than usual. But as the words settled in my ear, something inside me twisted, an unease that settled deeper than just paperwork. I asked him where it was, and he told me, a cabin on a lake in Maine, deep in the woods near a small town I'd never heard of. I asked who it had been left to, and his answer left me frozen. "It wasn't left to you," he said slowly. "The legal heir of the property is listed as Clara Monroe." I sat there staring at the phone long after the call ended, Evelyn's name echoing in my head, tangled now with this stranger's, Clara Monroe, a name that wasn't supposed to exist, a name that felt like a door she'd left cracked open just wide enough for me to find. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd hidden it on purpose, not because she didn't trust me, but because she wanted me to ask the questions she'd never had the strength, or maybe the right, to answer out loud. I drove to Maine 2 days later, the road long and winding through stretches of pine and silence, my thoughts louder than the engine as I replayed every conversation I'd ever had with Evelyn, scanning them for clues, for hints, for anything that might have pointed toward the secret. The cabin was modest, weathered cedar siding, moss-covered roof, a small porch facing a still lake that reflected the clouds like glass. It looked untouched for years, yet strangely preserved, like it had been waiting. The key was taped behind the mailbox, same place Evelyn used to hide hers at home, and the moment I stepped inside, I knew without question this place had belonged to her. The scent of lavender soap still clung to the bathroom, old books lined the shelves, and in the corner of the bedroom sat a trunk that matched the cedar chest from the basement. I opened it carefully, heart pounding, hands shaking, and inside I found letters, dozens of them, all addressed to the same person. Clara. At first, I thought it was just a pseudonym, a nickname, some romantic name Evelyn had used for herself in secret. But the more I read, the clearer it became, these weren't letters Evelyn wrote to herself. They were letters to a daughter she had before my father. A daughter no one had ever mentioned, not once, not even in whispers or drunken confessions at family gatherings. And that's when it hit me with terrifying clarity. Clara Monroe wasn't Evelyn's alias. Clara Monroe was Evelyn's first child. The letters told a story I never saw coming. Evelyn had gotten pregnant young, long before she met the man who would become my grandfather. She'd been forced to give the baby up, not by choice, but by the kind of pressure that crushes a woman's will under the weight of shame and expectation. Over the years, she tried to find Clara, tried to reconnect, tried to rebuild something from the ashes of what was taken from her. But every attempt was met with silence or closed doors. In one letter, Evelyn wrote, "I don't know if you hate me or if someone taught you to forget me, but I never stopped being your mother, not for one single day." I sat on the cabin floor for hours, reading every letter, every page, every plea written in ink now faded with time and regret. It shook me in a way nothing else had, not even the betrayal of my own parents. Because in those pages, I saw the root of Evelyn's heartbreak, the seed of everything she'd later become. And it made me wonder if all along, her fierce protection of me had come from more than just love. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was her second chance. Maybe I was never just her granddaughter. I was her redemption. But something else struck me too, and it settled into my bones with a chill I couldn't shake. If Evelyn had a daughter before my father, then I wasn't the first one they abandoned. I was just the first one who came back. That thought haunted me all the way home, lingering like a shadow in the corners of my mind, making me question everything I thought I understood about legacy and family and blood. Maybe Evelyn had been trying to shield me from more than just my parents. Maybe there were secrets even deeper than the ones I'd already uncovered. Maybe Clara's absence was a wound Evelyn could never close, and I'd been living inside the scar tissue all along. I still don't know why she didn't tell me, why she never said a word, why she left the cabin untouched, left the name untouched, left the truth buried beneath layers of grief and silence. But I do know this. Some people run from their pain, and others build shrines to it. Some people bury secrets, and others leave them out in the open, hoping someone brave enough will come along and ask the right questions. I guess some people never stop running. But some of us, we stay. We rise. And we build our own damn families.